The house felt alive in a way it hadn't for years. A low hum of excitement filled every room as I set up extra seating, arranged platters of snacks, and made last-minute adjustments to decorations. This was the first time I'd hosted the family reunion, and I wanted everything to be perfect. Every detail mattered: the flowers, the appetizers, the cozy seating, all carefully thought out to make everyone feel at home. I was just adjusting a string of fairy lights when I heard my husband call from the kitchen. "Laura, do we have enough ice?" "Yes, check the freezer," I replied, suppressing an eye roll. He'd been nervous all morning, pacing around like a caged animal, looking for small tasks to occupy himself. Hosting wasn't his strong suit, and I knew he would have rather spent his day off relaxing. But I loved these gatherings, the comfort of family filling our home, laughter and voices blending in a way that felt grounding. I heard the sound of car doors closing and voices rising outside. Glancing out the window, I saw a group of familiar faces: my sister, her husband, and their kids, each toting dishes covered with foil. I hurried to the door, opening it wide and welcoming them in with a big smile. As they entered, hugs and laughter filled the air, each person bringing a burst of energy that added to the house's warmth. "Laura, it looks incredible in here," my sister gasped, her eyes wide as she took in the decorations. She handed me a dish, her arm wrapping around my shoulder in a quick embrace. "You really went all out this time." "I just wanted everything to feel right," I replied, taking a step back to admire the scene. But my eyes kept drifting to the door, waiting for the last few cars to arrive. Finally, I saw him. Stephen, my nephew, was stepping out of a sleek black car, adjusting his jacket as he looked around. It had been years since I'd seen him, and I barely recognized the man he'd grown into. Last I remembered, he'd been a teenager, all limbs and awkwardness, but now he was an adult, taller, broader, with a quiet confidence in his stance that took me by surprise. I felt a strange mix of pride and nostalgia as I watched him approach. As he stepped through the doorway, he grinned. "Aunt Laura." His voice was warm, familiar, yet deeper now, filled with a maturity that hadn't been there before. "Stephen." I pulled him into a hug, momentarily surprised by how solid he felt, like hugging a stone pillar. "You've grown up so much. I can barely recognize you." "Guess I can't be the family baby forever, ha," he chuckled, flashing me a playful smile that held a hint of mischief. There was something so charming, yet endearingly familiar in that grin. I couldn't help but laugh along with him. We moved into the living room, where the family was already making themselves comfortable. The room buzzed with chatter as everyone caught up, voices overlapping and mingling in a comforting hum. Stephen was immediately surrounded by cousins and aunts, each eager to catch up with him and hear about his life. But I found myself stealing glances at him, my mind filled with memories of the shy boy he used to be and the man he'd become. The day went on in a blissful haze of laughter, stories, and food. Family members drifted between conversations, their voices rising and falling in waves. My husband was in the corner, laughing with his brother-in-law, and Stephen moved from group to group, effortlessly fitting in with everyone. I caught snippets of his conversation, stories of his college days, a funny mishap during his last vacation, plans for his future. His voice was magnetic, filled with an ease that pulled people in, including me. As the evening progressed, people settled into more intimate groups, and somehow, Stephen and I ended up together in the kitchen, organizing leftovers. He'd offered to help without a second thought, and I found myself appreciating his thoughtfulness. We worked in comfortable silence at first, moving around each other seamlessly as we packed up food and arranged containers. "So, Aunt Laura," he said suddenly, breaking the silence, "how's life been treating you?" The question caught me off guard and I hesitated. I'd been so focused on everyone else that I hadn't expected anyone to ask about me. "Oh, I said with a slight shrug, trying to keep my tone light. Same old, same old. Work, home, a few hobbies here and there." He looked at me, a small frown tugging at his lips. "Is that all? I mean, you used to be so adventurous. You're the one who inspired me to go backpacking last summer." The memory made me smile, and I found myself sharing stories I hadn't thought about in years, my own travels, my dreams, the things I'd wanted to do before life settled into routine. Stephen listened intently, his eyes never leaving mine, And for a moment, I felt like a younger version of myself, someone who hadn't yet been weighed down by responsibilities. As we continued talking, I felt a warmth growing between us, a connection that was both comforting and unsettling. There was something about the way he looked at me, his gaze steady and unflinching, that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in a long time. I told myself it was just the thrill of sharing stories, a reminder of my younger days, but there was an undercurrent to our conversation that I couldn't quite place, a flicker of something unspoken, lingering just below the surface. "Aunt Laura," he said, his voice softer, "you deserve to feel that excitement again. You're still that person, you know." His words struck me, stirring something deep within. I tried to laugh it off, brushing my hands on a towel as I avoided his gaze. "Oh, Stephen, that's sweet of you to say, but life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes you just have to settle into what's comfortable." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached out, his hand resting gently on my shoulder, and for a brief moment, I felt the weight of his hand through the thin fabric of my blouse. His touch was warm, grounding, but it sent a shiver down my spine that I quickly suppressed. "You don't have to settle," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're worth so much more than that." I felt my cheeks flush, a wave of unexpected heat washing over me. I forced myself to laugh, brushing off the strange feeling that had settled between us. "Thank you, Stephen. You always know how to make me feel better." He smiled, his gaze lingering a second longer than necessary before he turned back to the task at hand. But the moment had passed, and I found myself feeling oddly vulnerable, as if he'd seen a side of me that I'd tried to keep hidden for years. As the night wore on, the family slowly began to gather their things, preparing to head home. The house quieted, the laughter and voices fading into the background until only a few stragglers remained. My husband was already asleep, exhausted from the day's excitement, and I found myself standing by the door, saying goodbye to Stephen one last time. "Thank you for tonight, Aunt Laura," he said, his voice warm. He pulled me into a hug, and I felt the solid warmth of his embrace. There was a tenderness in the way he held me, a gentleness that made me feel safe and yet oddly exposed. "Anytime, Stephen," I replied, my voice soft as I pulled away, my heart inexplicably heavy. As he walked out the door, I stood there in the quiet, the weight of the day settling over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, a subtle change that had taken root and left me feeling both exhilarated and deeply uneasy. The night felt unusually still after everyone left, as if the house was exhaling a long-held breath. Silence filled the rooms that had once been alive with laughter, the remnants of the reunion lingering in the air like a fading perfume. I moved from one room to another, tidying up bits and pieces, the forgotten wine glass here, a crumpled napkin there. My husband had gone to bed hours ago, exhausted from hosting, and the house now belonged to me alone in the quiet hours. But my mind kept drifting back to Stephen. The more I tried to ignore it, the more persistent the memories became, like an itch I couldn't scratch. His words echoed in my head, his encouragement to rediscover the person I used to be. How had he known? I hadn't even realized how much I'd been missing until he said it out loud, awakening something I'd buried so deep I had almost forgotten it was there. But the look in his eyes, the warmth of his voice, his hand resting on my shoulder, they had stirred something I wasn't sure I wanted to face. As I wiped down the kitchen counters, my phone vibrated with a message. I picked it up, surprised to see Stephen's name flashing across the screen. "Thanks for tonight, Aunt Laura. I didn't realize how much I needed to talk to you." I hesitated, staring at his message a moment longer than necessary. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to leave it unanswered and close the door on whatever strange connection we had shared tonight. But another part of me, a part that felt curiously alive, that yearned for something more than the safe, predictable rhythm of my life, compelled me to respond. "I'm glad you came. It's been too long since we last saw each other." The response felt innocuous enough, yet there was a thrill in pressing send, as if I was dipping my toe into forbidden waters. I placed the phone down, my heart racing slightly, though I wasn't sure why. When it buzzed again just a minute later, I felt a surge of anticipation that caught me off guard. It's crazy how things change, right? You look different, good different. I could feel a blush creeping up my cheeks as I read his message. Different. What did that mean? It was such an innocent word, yet it carried an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. Was it just my imagination? Or had he meant something more? Thank you, Stephen. You've changed a lot too. All grown up now. I hit send and immediately regretted it, wondering if the message sounded odd, if it hinted at something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. But I couldn't deny the truth in my words. He was different too. No longer the awkward boy I remembered, but a confident, thoughtful young man. And tonight, as we talked in the kitchen, I'd felt something I hadn't felt in years, a spark, a flicker of something dangerous and thrilling. His response came quickly. Guess we both changed for the better. I still remember you as the fun aunt who'd sneak me extra dessert and let me stay up late to watch movies. I smiled at the memory, my fingers poised over the screen as I typed back. I guess I've gotten a bit boring since then. Boring? Not a chance. His response was immediate, as though he'd been waiting for me to say it. Tonight made me realize you're still the same. Just maybe a bit more reserved. A strange, unexpected thrill washed over me as I read his message. There was something intimate about the way he spoke to me, as if he saw through the mask I wore, past the responsibilities, the routines, and straight to the person I used to be. And for a moment, it felt as though he was reaching out, offering a lifeline back to that part of myself I'd lost somewhere along the way. I forced myself to put the phone down, turning my attention back to the dishes piled in the sink. But even as I scrubbed and rinsed, I couldn't shake the image of him from my mind. His laugh, the way he'd looked at me, the warmth in his gaze that lingered a bit too long. It was all harmless, I told myself, just family reconnecting after time apart. Yet the way he had made me feel, seen in a way I hadn't felt in years, was more powerful than I wanted to admit. I sighed, feeling the weight of the evening settle over me. Part of me felt foolish, as if I was indulging in some childish fantasy that had no place in my life. I was married, settled, content with the life I had built, and yet tonight had unsettled something. A quiet discontent that had simmered below the surface, unacknowledged and ignored. The phone buzzed again, and I found myself glancing over, unable to resist. His message glowed on the screen, simple and direct. Hey, maybe we could get coffee sometime? I'd love to hear more about your travels. The idea sent a flutter of excitement through me, a small thrill that felt oddly exhilarating. I knew I should say no, that there was no need for us to spend time alone. But the part of me that had felt so alive tonight, that yearned for something more than the daily routine, hesitated. I'd like that, I replied before I could second-guess myself, my fingers hovering over the screen as I pressed send. I set the phone down, feeling a mix of excitement and guilt swirling within me. It was just coffee, just a harmless chat with family. But as I stood there, the house quiet around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was tiptoeing into dangerous territory, the kind of place you didn't return from unchanged. The next few days felt strange, as though a shift had taken place that I couldn't quite put into words. My husband noticed nothing unusual, still caught up in the daily humdrum of work and life, his attentions focused elsewhere. But I felt like I was carrying a secret, a tiny ember of excitement hidden deep within me, something I could return to when the weight of routine felt too heavy. Stephen and I exchanged a few messages over the week, mostly innocent, small check-ins and little jokes. But there was an undercurrent to our conversations that neither of us acknowledged, an unspoken connection that simmered just below the surface. Every message from him felt like a spark, igniting something in me that I'd long believed had faded. When the day of our coffee meetup arrived, I found myself carefully choosing my outfit, paying attention to details I hadn't considered in years. A subtle hint of perfume, a touch of lipstick, my favorite dress that made me feel alive and young. I told myself it was just to look presentable, that it was normal to want to make a good impression. But a part of me knew there was more to it, something I didn't want to admit. When I arrived at the cafe, Stephen was already there, seated by the window. He looked up as I entered, his face breaking into a warm smile that sent a thrill through me. I felt my heart skip a beat as I approached, a rush of excitement coursing through me, and for a moment, I forgot everything else, my responsibilities, my husband, the life waiting for me back home. "Aunt Laura," he greeted, standing up to give me a quick hug. His embrace was warm, lingering just a second longer than necessary, and I felt a strange sense of comfort in his presence. We sat down, ordering our drinks and falling into an easy conversation that felt both familiar and new. We talked about everything: his college life, my travels, memories of family gatherings long past. His laughter was contagious, his stories filled with a lightheartedness that made me feel young again, as though I was rediscovering a part of myself I'd lost. And every now and then he'd look at me with that same steady gaze, his eyes filled with a warmth that was both endearing and unsettling. As the conversation flowed, I felt a growing connection between us, something that transcended the boundaries of family. It was subtle, unspoken, but it lingered in the air, filling the space between us with an undeniable tension. And for the first time, I let myself bask in it, allowing myself to feel the thrill of the forbidden, the allure of something I knew I shouldn't want. But as I sat there, laughing with him, feeling more alive than I had in years, I couldn't bring myself to look away. The next few days after our coffee meetup went by in a blur. My routine with my husband remained unchanged: work, dinners, quiet evenings, spent watching TV on the couch. But every so often I would find myself slipping into memories of my time with Stephen. It wasn't just the conversations we shared. It was how he looked at me, the way he listened, making me feel like the most important person in the room. That feeling lingered, intoxicating and dangerous, fueling an unspoken longing I couldn't shake. Then, a few days later, my husband announced he'd be traveling for work again. Normally, his absence was something I accepted with routine resignation, a regular part of our lives that I'd grown used to. But this time I felt an undercurrent of excitement bubbling within me, as if his leaving somehow freed me from the constraints I hadn't realized I'd felt. The night before he left, we sat at the dinner table in silence, both of us focused on our food. I tried to feel something, some pang of regret, a desire to cling to him, to share these quiet moments and savor them before he went away. But there was only emptiness, a growing chasm that had been there for years, hidden beneath polite conversations and shared routines. When he finally left in the early hours of the morning, kissing me goodbye with a peck that barely brushed my cheek, I felt a sense of relief that I quickly tried to ignore. As his car pulled out of the driveway, I found myself standing at the window, watching the taillights fade into the darkness, feeling as though a weight had been lifted. The day passed slowly, filled with household chores and errands, tasks that kept my mind occupied. But every so often, I'd glance at my phone, wondering if Stephen would message me. Part of me told myself it was wrong, that I was playing with fire. But another part of me, the part that had awakened that night during the family reunion, craved the thrill, the excitement of connecting with him again. In the late afternoon, as I was cleaning up in the kitchen, my phone buzzed on the counter. I picked it up, my heart skipping a beat when I saw Stephen's name. "Hey, Aunt Laura, are you free tonight? I was thinking of swinging by if you're up for some company." I stared at the message, my mind racing. It was innocent enough, just a simple visit, family spending time together. Yet I knew there was something more behind his words, a hint of something unspoken that sent a thrill through me. "Sure, that sounds nice. Come by any time," I replied, my fingers trembling slightly as I hit send. The rest of the evening was a blur of anticipation. I checked the clock more times than I'd like to admit, fussing over small details in the house, adjusting pillows, straightening up the living room, tidying the kitchen. My nerves felt like they were on edge, a strange mix of excitement and guilt churning in my stomach. Finally, there was a knock at the door. I took a steadying breath before opening it, my heart racing as I saw Stephen standing there, holding a bottle of wine and smiling in that easy, charming way that I found increasingly hard to resist. "Aunt Laura," he greeted warmly, stepping inside as I held the door open. He gave me a quick hug, the warmth of his embrace lingering even after he pulled away. I brought a little something for us to share, he said, holding up the bottle with a grin. You didn't have to, I replied, feeling a blush rise to my cheeks. But I led him into the kitchen, pulling out 2 glasses as he uncorked the bottle. We settled into the familiar rhythm of conversation, our words flowing easily as we sipped wine and shared stories. The kitchen felt cozy, intimate, as the soft glow from the overhead light cast warm shadows across the room. But as the evening wore on, I felt the air grow heavy, a subtle tension building between us that neither of us acknowledged. At one point, he reached over to pour me another glass, his hand brushing against mine. It was a small, innocent touch, but it sent a shiver through me, the warmth of his skin lingering long after he pulled away. I glanced up, meeting his gaze, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. There was something in his eyes, a softness, a warmth that seemed to see straight through me, piercing through the layers of composure I'd carefully constructed. You look happy, he said quietly, his gaze steady on mine, different from last time we saw each other. I felt a lump form in my throat, a wave of emotions rising to the surface. Maybe I am, I replied softly, my voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes it's nice to just be myself, you know? He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. I get it. It's easy to lose yourself in all the expectations, isn't it? His words struck a chord deep within me, and I found myself nodding, unable to tear my gaze away. Yeah, I think I've spent so much time being who everyone expects me to be that I forgot who I was. My voice faltered, the vulnerability of my admission catching me off guard. Stephen reached out, his hand covering mine, his touch warm and grounding. You don't have to pretend with me, Aunt Laura, he said softly, his voice filled with a sincerity that made my heart ache. I see you. The weight of his words settled over me, filling the silence between us with an intensity that felt both thrilling and terrifying. I felt exposed, as if he could see straight through to the part of me that had yearned for something more, something beyond the safe, comfortable life I'd settled into. I took a shaky breath, my eyes dropping to our intertwined hands, Steve and I. Before I could finish, he gently squeezed my hand, his touch lingering as he searched my gaze. It's okay, he murmured, his voice a soothing balm to the storm of emotions swirling within me. The tension between us grew, a silent, unspoken connection that filled the air, thick and electric. And in that moment, I felt a pull, magnetic, undeniable force drawing me closer to him, bridging the gap that had been slowly closing since the night of the reunion. He leaned in, his face inches from mine, his eyes filled with a warmth that sent a shiver down my spine. I could feel his breath warm against my skin, and I felt myself leaning in, the world around us fading away, until there was nothing but the two of us, suspended in a moment that felt both forbidden and inevitable. But just as our lips were about to meet, a sudden surge of guilt washed over me, grounding me back to reality. I pulled away, my heart racing, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I'm sorry, I stammered, feeling heat rise in my cheeks as I stepped back, putting distance between us. Stephen looked at me, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face, but he quickly masked it with a gentle smile. It's okay, Laura, he said softly, his voice steady, reassuring. I didn't mean to, we don't have to. No, I struggled to find the words, my mind reeling from the intensity of the moment. It's just complicated. He nodded, his gaze soft and understanding. I get it, really? I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I shook my head, the guilt gnawing at me as I forced myself to look away. No, you didn't. It's not you, Stephen. It's just everything. He reached out, his hand lightly brushing my arm in a comforting gesture. I understand, Aunt Laura. I want you to be happy. His words stirred something deep within me, a longing that I could no longer ignore. I felt the weight of his gaze, his quiet understanding, and for a moment I wished things were different, that I was free to feel this way, to explore the connection between us without the constraints of my life, my responsibilities. Thank you, Stephen, I murmured, my voice thick with emotion. I needed to hear that. We stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us, filling the air with a tension that was both comforting and bittersweet. I knew I couldn't go down this path, that the cost was too high. But as I looked into his eyes, filled with warmth and understanding, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years, a desire for something more, a longing for a connection that transcended the safe, predictable life I'd built. When he finally left, I stood in the kitchen, the quiet settling around me, the echoes of our conversation lingering in the air. And as I closed the door behind him, I knew that this was only the beginning, that the connection between us had been forged, a bond that couldn't easily be broken. But in that moment, I wasn't sure if I wanted it to be. The following week, I felt the weight of that night in the kitchen lingering like a ghost that wouldn't fade. My husband returned from his trip, slipping seamlessly back into our daily rhythm, but I felt like I was living in two worlds. The first was the steady, predictable life I had always known, the life with him. The other was something I kept hidden, a world of stolen glances and quiet anticipation. In the evenings, after he'd gone to bed, I would find myself in the kitchen, surrounded by memories of Stephen's warm touch, his earnest words, and the magnetic pull I couldn't ignore. Stephen continued texting me, though he kept things light. His messages were casual, filled with stories about his work, little jokes, and the occasional late-night thought. But even in their simplicity, each message felt like a tether, pulling me into something I didn't know how to resist. Every vibration of my phone sent a thrill through me, and I found myself lingering on his words longer than I wanted to admit. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my phone vibrated softly. My husband was snoring beside me, completely oblivious to the storm of emotions churning within me. I glanced at the screen, heart quickening when I saw it was a message from Stephen. "Can't sleep. Mind if I call you?" The rational part of me told me to say no, to ignore it, and let things settle back into the routine that felt safe and stable. But my fingers moved of their own accord, typing a simple response before I could think better of it. "Sure, just keep it quiet." Within seconds, my phone buzzed with his incoming call. I slipped out of bed, tiptoeing down the hall and into the living room, my heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear. I sank onto the couch, taking a deep breath before answering. "Hey," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady as I pressed the phone to my ear. "Hey," he replied softly, his voice carrying a warmth that wrapped around me like a blanket. "Sorry, I didn't mean to keep you up." "You didn't. I was already awake." I paused, wondering how much to admit. Sometimes it's just hard to sleep. "Yeah, I know the feeling." There was a brief silence before he spoke again, his voice tinged with a vulnerability that caught me off guard. "I keep thinking about that night, you know. I feel like I should apologize, but at the same time I don't want to." A shiver ran through me, his words striking a chord that I couldn't ignore. I felt exposed, as if he was speaking directly to the part of me that had been longing for something I didn't fully understand. "I don't want you to, either," I murmured, my voice barely audible. He hesitated, and I could almost picture him, sitting in his room, trying to find the right words. "It's strange, isn't it? How you can feel so connected to someone you've known your whole life, but in a way that feels new." "Yes," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. "It feels like I don't know. Like I'm seeing you for the first time." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, a shared understanding that transcended anything I'd ever experienced. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of his breathing fill the quiet space around me, grounding me in the reality of this moment. "Aunt Laura," he began, his voice a mixture of hesitation and desire, "do you ever wonder if things could be different?" His question lingered in the air, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to face. I swallowed, trying to find the right response, but the words stuck in my throat, caught between fear and longing. Sometimes I finally admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper, "But I don't know if it's right." "Maybe it doesn't have to be right," he replied softly, his voice tinged with a quiet intensity that made my pulse quicken. "Maybe it just has to be real." The weight of his words settled over me, filling the silence with a sense of possibility that both excited and terrified me. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, one step away from plunging into something unknown, something that could change everything. "I don't know what to do, Stephen," I confessed, my voice trembling with the vulnerability of my admission. "I feel lost, torn." "Then let me be here for you," he said gently, his voice filled with a tenderness that made my heart ache. "You don't have to decide anything. Just let me be here." The simplicity of his offer, the genuine kindness in his words, broke down the walls I had carefully constructed around myself. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, surprised by the depth of the emotions swirling within me, emotions I had suppressed for so long that they had become a part of my very being. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice choked with gratitude and relief. "Thank you for seeing me." We stayed on the phone for hours, talking about everything and nothing, letting our words fill the spaces between us, bridging the gap that had always felt unbridgeable. He shared his dreams, his fears, his regrets, and I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't in years. There was a freedom in speaking to him, a sense of release that allowed me to be honest, raw, real. The night drifted by in a haze of quiet laughter and soft whispers, and by the time dawn began to break, I felt like I had discovered a part of myself I hadn't known existed. Stephen had awakened something within me, something I hadn't even realized I'd lost, and I knew, deep down, that there was no going back. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the window, casting a warm glow across the room, I felt a pang of sadness, knowing that this moment, this fragile, beautiful connection would have to end, at least for now. "Stephen," I murmured, my voice filled with a reluctant finality. I should go." "I know," he replied softly, his voice tinged with the same reluctance. "But thank you. For tonight. For letting me in." I felt a lump form in my throat, the weight of his words settling over me like a warm embrace. "Thank you, too, for everything." We lingered in silence for a moment, neither of us wanting to hang up, clinging to the last remnants of the night we'd shared. But eventually, I knew I had to let go, to return to the world that awaited me on the other side of this phone call. "Good night, Stephen," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "Good night, Aunt Laura," he replied, his voice soft and filled with a quiet yearning that mirrored my own. I hung up, sitting alone in the quiet of the living room, the weight of the night settling over me. I felt a strange mix of peace and sorrow, a bittersweet ache that lingered as I returned to bed, slipping under the covers beside my husband, who hadn't even stirred. As I lay there, my mind drifted back to Stephen, to the warmth of his words, the comfort of his presence, the undeniable connection we shared. I knew that what we had was fragile, fleeting, a delicate thread that could unravel at any moment. But for now it was enough. It was enough to know that I was seen, that I was understood, that there was someone who cared for me in a way I hadn't known I needed. And as I closed my eyes, letting the memories of our conversation wash over me, I felt a sense of calm settle within me, a quiet certainty that, no matter what happened, this moment, this connection would stay with me, a secret I would carry close to my heart, hidden in the quiet spaces of my soul. The days that followed our late-night phone call felt like a delicate balancing act, a game of maintaining composure while carrying a secret that pulsed like a heartbeat just beneath the surface. My husband noticed nothing different, his routine and attention tied up with work and the daily rhythms of life we'd grown so accustomed to. I kept busy with my responsibilities, but each text from Stephen felt like a touchstone, a reminder of the person I had allowed myself to become when I was with him, open, alive, seen. On Friday, my husband mentioned he'd be out for the evening with a few work friends, something he'd planned weeks ago. Normally, these nights were a chance for me to unwind alone, catching up on a favorite show or indulging in a long bath. But this time, an unbidden thought slipped into my mind, a whisper, a quiet suggestion that lingered and refused to fade. I didn't reach out to Stephen, but I found myself thinking of him, wondering if he was free. The hours dragged by, the anticipation building in my chest until it was almost too much to bear. Just as I was about to send him a casual message, my phone buzzed. "What are you up tonight?" It was him. I stared at the screen, feeling a strange thrill that he'd reached out without prompting, as if he could sense the unspoken connection pulling us together. I hesitated for only a moment before replying. Not much. Home alone. There was a pause before his response came, a message that felt innocent enough but carried an undercurrent that I could feel even through the screen. Want some company? I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. But that part of me, the part that longed for connection, for something beyond the quiet, predictable life I'd lived for so long, won over. Sure, come by. The house was quiet when he arrived, and as I opened the door, a rush of warmth filled me. Stephen stepped inside, his presence immediately grounding me, calming the nerves that had been building since I'd agreed to let him come over. He greeted me with a warm smile, and in that moment, all the tension I'd been carrying seemed to melt away. Hey, he said softly, his voice a soothing balm to the storm of emotions swirling within me. Hey, I replied, my own voice softer than usual, almost tentative. I gestured for him to come in, closing the door behind him as he slipped off his jacket and hung it by the door. We made our way to the living room, settling on the couch in comfortable silence. I poured us both a glass of wine, and we sipped slowly, letting the quiet stretch between us, filling the space with an intimacy that felt both familiar and foreign. I glanced over at him, feeling the weight of his gaze as he looked at me, his eyes filled with a warmth that made my heart ache. You look beautiful tonight, Aunt Laura, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, yet his words carried a weight that settled over me, filling me with a mixture of pride and vulnerability. Thank you, I replied, feeling a blush rise to my cheeks. I looked away, trying to steady myself, but the warmth in his gaze was like a tether, pulling me back to him. We talked, our conversation meandering through light topics, shared memories, quiet laughter. The familiarity of it all was comforting, lulling me into a sense of security. But beneath the surface there was a tension, an unspoken connection that pulsed between us, growing stronger with each passing moment. At some point, the conversation slowed and we found ourselves sitting in a comfortable silence. I glanced at him, catching his gaze, and in that moment, I felt a pull, a magnetic, undeniable force that drew me closer to him. The air between us grew thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken words, unfulfilled desires. Without thinking, I found myself leaning in, the space between us shrinking, until there was nothing but a whisper of distance separating us. He looked at me, his gaze steady, filled with a quiet intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. And then, as if by some unspoken agreement, we closed the distance, our lips meeting in a soft, tentative kiss. The world fell away, the weight of my responsibilities, the constraints of reality slipping into oblivion as I lost myself in the warmth of his embrace. His hand found mine, fingers intertwining as our kiss deepened, growing from a gentle touch into something fierce, urgent. I felt his other hand cradle my face, his touch gentle yet grounding, anchoring me in the moment, as if he were the only thing keeping me from drifting away. In the back of my mind, a voice whispered that this was wrong, that I was crossing a line I could never uncross. But in that moment, the pull of connection, the need for something real, something raw and unfiltered, was stronger than any guilt I might have felt. I allowed myself to let go, to sink into the sensation, the thrill of feeling alive in a way I hadn't in years. He pulled back, his forehead resting against mine, his breath warm against my skin as we caught our breath. I looked at him, seeing a mix of emotions mirrored in his eyes: desire, longing, a hint of uncertainty. Are you okay? He asked softly, his voice laced with concern, his thumb gently stroking my cheek. I nodded, my heart racing, my voice barely more than a whisper. Yes, I don't know where this is going. Neither do I, he replied, his voice filled with a quiet honesty that made my heart ache. But I know that I care about you, Aunt Laura. I always have. And if this is something you want, then I'm here. I'm here for you. His words washed over me, filling me with a warmth, a reassurance that somehow made everything feel both right and wrong at the same time. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, the weight of the moment pressing down on me, as I realized the gravity of what we were stepping into. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice trembling as I looked at him, feeling a vulnerability I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. He reached up, gently brushing the tear from my cheek, his touch tender, filled with a gentleness that made my heart swell. "You don't have to be scared," he murmured, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere. Whatever happens, I'm here." We sat in silence, the weight of his words settling over us, filling the air with a sense of finality, of commitment that I hadn't expected. And in that moment, I felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet acceptance that allowed me to let go of the fear, the uncertainty, the guilt. I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my cheek. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, wrapped in each other's warmth, the world outside fading into oblivion. There was no rush, no urgency, just a quiet, gentle intimacy that filled the space between us, grounding us in the reality of the moment. As the night wore on, he held me close, his arms wrapped around me in a protective embrace that made me feel safe, cherished. I knew that what we had was fragile, delicate, a fleeting connection that could shatter at any moment. But in that moment, it was enough. It was enough to know that I was seen, that I was loved, that I was more than just a wife, a caretaker, a fixture in someone else's life. Eventually, the quiet intimacy of the moment grew too heavy, and I pulled away, looking at him with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. I think I should go to bed," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. He nodded, his gaze soft, filled with understanding. "I get it," he replied, his voice steady, though I could see the hint of disappointment in his eyes. I stood up, feeling a strange mix of relief and regret as I took a step toward the hallway. But before I could leave, he reached out, catching my hand, pulling me back for one last embrace. His arms wrapped around me, warm and comforting, grounding me in the reality of our connection. "Good night, Aunt Laura," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet reverence that made my heart ache. "Good night, Stephen," I replied softly, my voice barely above a whisper. I pulled away, walking down the hall to my bedroom, the weight of the night settling over me as I closed the door behind me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart heavy with the knowledge that I had crossed a line I could never uncross. But as I closed my eyes, letting the memories of the night wash over me, I knew, deep down, that I wouldn't change a thing. The following days were a strange, silent whirlwind. Everything felt the same on the surface: my husband's usual routines, the regular rhythm of household chores, the comforting predictability of morning coffee and evening dinners. Yet beneath the surface, a new reality pulsed within me, an awareness of the secret I carried, a memory that lingered in the spaces between my everyday actions. My life had split in two, one foot in my familiar world, the other in a place I never thought I'd enter. Stephen didn't reach out, and I wondered if he was feeling the same turmoil, the same conflict between the intense connection we'd shared and the weight of our actions. I wanted to text him, to reach out with something casual, something light, that would bridge the silence between us without shattering the delicate balance of our hidden truth. But each time I tried, I couldn't bring myself to hit send, the guilt gnawing at me, whispering that I had already crossed enough lines. One night, as I lay beside my husband, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, I felt the weight of my actions pressing down on me, filling the room with an oppressive heaviness. I closed my eyes, trying to will away the memory of Stephen's touch, the warmth of his embrace, the quiet promise in his gaze. But no matter how hard I tried, the memory persisted, a vivid imprint that refused to fade. Guilt became my constant companion, a shadow that followed me through each day, darkening every moment of peace, every instance of joy. It was a feeling I couldn't escape, a reminder of the boundary I had crossed, the vow I had broken. I found myself pulling away from my husband, avoiding his touch, his casual affection, as if I could somehow shield him from the truth by keeping my distance. But he noticed. I could see it in the way he looked at me, a quiet weariness in his gaze, a question that lingered unspoken between us. He began watching me more closely, his eyes lingering on me a beat longer, his expressions more guarded. The easy rhythm of our relationship had shifted, replaced by a tension I hadn't anticipated, a suspicion that cut deeper than I wanted to admit. One evening, after a tense and quiet dinner, he put his fork down, his gaze fixed on me, a serious expression settling over his features. "Laura," he began, his voice low, controlled, yet I could sense the storm brewing beneath his words. "Is everything okay?" I froze, my mind racing as I struggled to compose myself. "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile, though I could feel my pulse quicken, the familiar rush of guilt tightening in my chest. "Why do you ask?" He hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied me. "You've seemed distant, different, like something's been on your mind." I looked away, my heart pounding as I searched for a way to deflect his question, to ease his suspicions without giving away the truth. "It's just work has been stressful," I lied, the words feeling foreign and heavy on my tongue. "I've been a little overwhelmed." He nodded, though I could see the doubt in his eyes, the uncertainty that lingered as he looked at me, his gaze penetrating, as if he could see straight through the mask I wore. "If there's anything you want to talk about, anything at all, I'm here." His words, spoken with such sincerity, cut through me like a knife. I felt a pang of regret, a longing to reach out, to take his hand and confess everything, to free myself from the weight of the lie that had woven itself into the fabric of our lives. But the thought of hurting him, of shattering the trust we had built, was too much to bear. "Thank you," I replied softly, forcing another smile as I avoided his gaze, my heart heavy with the knowledge that I was betraying him in more ways than one. That night, I lay awake long after he'd fallen asleep, the guilt pressing down on me, suffocating me with its relentless weight. I knew that what I was doing was wrong, that the lie I was living was not sustainable, that it would eventually unravel, leaving nothing but heartache and ruin in its wake. But the memory of Stephen, the connection we had shared, was like a drug, a forbidden thrill that I couldn't bring myself to let go of. In the days that followed, I tried to bury myself in the familiar routines of life, hoping that the guilt would fade, that the memory of Stephen would become just that, a memory, something to be locked away, hidden in the quiet recesses of my mind. But he lingered, a presence that haunted me in moments of stillness, in the quiet spaces of my day. Then, one evening, when I was alone in the house, my phone buzzed with a message. My heart skipped a beat as I saw Stephen's name on the screen, a surge of excitement and fear flooding through me. "I miss you." The simplicity of his words, the raw honesty of his confession, hit me with a force that left me breathless. I stared at the message, my mind racing, my heart pounding as I struggled to find a response, to give voice to the feelings that had been building within me, the longing that had simmered beneath the surface since that night. "I miss you too," I finally replied, the words slipping from my fingers before I could second-guess myself. There was a pause before his response came, a message that sent a shiver down my spine, filling me with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "Can we see each other? Just for a little while?" I knew that agreeing to meet him would only deepen the lie, entangle me further in the web of deception I had woven. But the thought of seeing him again, of feeling his warmth, his touch, was too powerful to resist. "Yes," I typed, the single word, both a confession and a surrender. We agreed to meet the following day, a quiet park on the outskirts of town, a place where we could be alone, hidden from the watchful eyes of the world. As I drove to meet him, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions: guilt, fear, excitement, a tumultuous blend that left me feeling both alive and broken. When I arrived, he was waiting by the trees, his gaze lifting to meet mine as I approached, a quiet intensity in his eyes that made my heart ache. Without a word, he reached for me, pulling me into an embrace that felt both familiar and foreign, a collision of comfort and desire that left me breathless. "I didn't think you'd come," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet vulnerability that made my heart swell. "I didn't think I would either," I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper, but I couldn't stay away. We stood in silence, wrapped in each other's warmth, the weight of our connection pressing down on us, filling the air with a tension that was both exhilarating and suffocating. I looked up at him, feeling the intensity of his gaze, the quiet longing that mirrored my own, and in that moment, the lie I was living faded into oblivion, replaced by the raw, unfiltered reality of our connection. He leaned down, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was soft, tentative, yet filled with an urgency that spoke to the depths of our feelings, the unspoken truth that lingered between us. I felt myself melting into him, the boundaries of my life slipping away as I lost myself in the warmth of his embrace. The thrill of the forbidden consuming me, filling me with a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. But as the kiss deepened, a surge of guilt washed over me, grounding me in the reality of what I was doing, the lie I was perpetuating. I pulled away, my breath shaky, my heart heavy with the weight of my actions. "Stephen, I can't keep doing this," I whispered, my voice filled with a sorrow that mirrored the regret in his eyes. He nodded, his gaze soft, filled with understanding. "I know," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "but I don't know how to let go." The words hung between us, a painful truth that neither of us could deny, a confession of the bond that had woven itself into the fabric of our lives, a bond that was as beautiful as it was destructive. We stood in silence, the weight of our unspoken feelings pressing down on us, filling the air with a sorrow that was both tender and heart-wrenching. And in that moment, I knew that no matter how hard we tried, we could never truly walk away, that the lie we were living was more than just a deception. It was a part of who we had become, a part of the love we had found in the quiet spaces of our lives. The next morning, I woke up with a lingering sense of dread, a feeling I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. Every moment I'd shared with Stephen haunted me, the way he'd looked at me, the intensity of our connection, the kiss that had held both promise and pain. The guilt weighed heavier than ever, and I felt the edges of my carefully constructed life begin to fray, the stability I'd once known slipping through my fingers. At breakfast, my husband was unusually quiet, his gaze lingering on me with a hint of suspicion that made my skin prickle. He was sipping his coffee, his eyes narrowed slightly, watching me with a quiet intensity that felt like an accusation, though he hadn't spoken a word. "Is something wrong?" I finally asked, forcing my voice to stay steady as I met his gaze. He set his coffee mug down slowly, his fingers tapping the edge in a way that betrayed his unease. "I could ask you the same thing," he replied, his tone controlled, yet I could sense the tension simmering beneath the surface. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing as I tried to compose myself. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his eyes narrowing further as he studied me. "You've been distant, different, like something's been on your mind that you're not telling me." I felt a lump form in my throat, the weight of my deception pressing down on me, suffocating me with the knowledge that he could sense the change, that he was beginning to piece together the truth. I searched for a lie, an excuse that would placate him, but my mind felt foggy, clouded by the guilt and shame that had become my constant companions. "It's just work," I lied, my voice barely above a whisper as I forced myself to meet his gaze. "Things have been stressful, and I guess it's been weighing on me." He nodded, though I could see the doubt in his eyes, the unspoken question that lingered as he watched me, his gaze piercing, as if he could see straight through the mask I wore. "If there's something else, something you need to talk about, I'm here. You know that, right?" The sincerity in his words cut through me like a knife, a painful reminder of the trust I had shattered, the vow I had broken. I forced a smile, though it felt hollow, empty. "I know. Thank you." He studied me for a moment longer, his gaze lingering on me, with a quiet intensity that made my skin prickle, as if he were searching for a crack in the facade, a hint of the truth I was so desperately trying to hide. But eventually he looked away, his shoulders slumping slightly as he picked up his coffee mug, his silence a painful reminder of the distance I had created between us. As the day wore on, I found myself growing more anxious, the weight of my deception pressing down on me, suffocating me with its relentless presence. Every time my husband looked at me, I felt a surge of guilt, a fear that he could see through the lie, that he was beginning to suspect the truth. And then, as if to confirm my worst fears, I noticed him watching me more closely, his gaze lingering on me with a quiet suspicion that made my heart pound. He began asking me questions, subtle, probing inquiries that hinted at his growing unease, his suspicion that something was amiss. One evening, as I was tidying up the living room, he approached me, his expression serious, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. "Laura," he began, his voice low, controlled. "I need to ask you something." I froze, my heart racing as I looked up at him, the guilt gnawing at me, whispering that he knew, that he had pieced together the truth. "What is it?" He took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering as he studied me. Have you been seeing someone else?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, filling the space between us with a tension that was both painful and terrifying. I felt my pulse quicken, my mind racing as I searched for a response, the weight of the lie pressing down on me, threatening to crush me beneath its relentless pressure. "No," I replied, the lie slipping from my lips before I could stop it, my voice trembling with the effort to maintain my composure. "Of course not. Why would you even think that?" He hesitated, his gaze softening slightly as he looked at me, his expression a mixture of doubt and hurt. "I don't know. It's just you've been so distant, Laura. Like you're somewhere else, somewhere I can't reach." His words cut through me, a painful reminder of the distance I had created between us, the love I had betrayed in my search for something more, something I couldn't even define. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, the weight of my actions pressing down on me, filling me with a sorrow that mirrored the regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way." He reached out, his hand covering mine, his touch warm and grounding, yet it only heightened the ache in my heart, the knowledge that I had shattered the trust we had built. I don't want to lose you, Laura. I love you." The sincerity in his words, the quiet desperation in his gaze, broke down the walls I had carefully constructed, leaving me exposed, vulnerable, the weight of my actions pressing down on me, filling me with a shame that I couldn't escape. "I love you too," I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper, though the words felt hollow. A reminder of the lie I was living, the truth I couldn't bring myself to confess. In the days that followed, the tension between us grew, an unspoken strain that filled the air with a sense of foreboding, a quiet suspicion that lingered, refusing to fade. I felt as if I were living on borrowed time, each moment filled with the fear that he would uncover the truth, that my carefully constructed facade would come crashing down, leaving nothing but here it is, and ruin in its wake. And then, one evening, as I was finishing up some work on my laptop, he entered the room, his expression serious, his gaze fixed on me with a quiet intensity that made my heart pound. "Laura," he began, his voice low, controlled, though I could sense the anger simmering beneath the surface. "I found something on your phone." My heart dropped, a surge of panic flooding through me as I looked up at him, my mind racing, the weight of my deception pressing down on me, suffocating me with its relentless presence. What did you find?" I stammered, my voice trembling with the fear that had taken hold of me, the knowledge that my secret was slipping through my fingers, that the lie I had been living was about to unravel. He held up my phone, his expression a mixture of anger and betrayal as he turned the screen toward me, revealing a message from Stephen, a simple, innocent text that had slipped through my carefully constructed web of lies, a crack in the facade that I couldn't repair. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice filled with a quiet fury that made my heart ache, a painful reminder of the trust I had shattered, the love I had betrayed. I felt the world slip away, the weight of my actions pressing down on me, filling me with a sorrow that I couldn't escape, a regret that threatened to consume me whole. I opened my mouth, searching for a response, a way to explain, to justify, but no words came, only silence, a painful, suffocating silence that filled the room, heavy with the truth I just so desperately to hide. He stared at me, his gaze piercing, filled with a mixture of anger and hurt that cut through me, leaving me raw, exposed, the reality of my actions laid bare before him. "I trusted you," he whispered, his voice filled with a pain that mirrored my own, a sorrow that echoed through the silence, filling the space between us with a sense of finality, a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that nothing would ever be the same. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me, filling me with a shame that I couldn't escape, a regret that clung to me like a shroud, suffocating me with its relentless presence. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion, though the words felt hollow, empty, a confession that could never undo the damage I had done, the trust I had shattered. He looked at me, his gaze filled with a quiet, heart-wrenching disappointment that made my heart ache, a painful reminder of the love we had once shared, the life we had built, now fractured, broken, a casualty of my betrayal. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the quiet, suffocating silence of our home, the weight of my actions pressing down on me, filling me with a sorrow that I couldn't escape, a regret that would linger, haunting me in the quiet spaces of my soul. The silence after he walked away was deafening, pressing in on me from every corner of the house. I stood frozen, my mind reeling, the reality of what I had done settling over me with a crushing finality. My husband's words echoed in my mind, each one a painful reminder of the trust I had shattered, the life I had broken in my search for something I couldn't even define. I tried to sleep that night, but every time I closed my eyes, memories of Stephen and the choices I'd made filled my mind, replaying in painful detail. Images flashed in quick succession, the warmth of Stephen's gaze, the gentle way he'd held me, the laughter we'd shared, all moments that had felt real, honest, but now felt hollow and haunting. And beneath it all was my husband's hurt, his eyes filled with an anguish that was now mine to carry. In the morning, the house was empty. My husband had left early, his side of the bed untouched, his absence a silent confirmation of the distance I had created between us. I knew I couldn't let things remain as they were. This wasn't something that could be smoothed over or ignored. I had to confront what I'd done to him, to us, to myself. As the morning light filled the house, I went to my husband's office, where he had retreated to in the aftermath. The door was slightly ajar, and I took a deep breath before stepping inside. He looked up, his gaze cool, distant, yet filled with a sadness that made my heart ache. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't answer right away, only watching me with a guarded expression. But eventually he nodded, gesturing for me to sit down. I took a seat across from him, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me, filling the space between us with an oppressive tension. "I'm sorry," I began, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to even begin to apologize for what I've done. I know I hurt you, and I know I betrayed your trust in a way that's unforgivable." He stared at me, his expression unreadable, his silence a painful reminder of the distance I had created between us. But I forced myself to continue, to give voice to the remorse that had been building within me, the guilt that had consumed me. "I don't expect you to forgive me," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't even know if I can forgive myself. I made choices that were selfish, choices that hurt you, hurt us, and I don't know how to undo the damage I've caused." For a moment he didn't respond, his gaze fixed on me with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, filled with a quiet pain that made my heart ache. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this, Laura? What was so wrong with us, with our life, that you had to find whatever it was you were looking for with him?" I felt a tear slip down my cheek, the weight of his question pressing down on me, forcing me to confront the truth I had been avoiding. "It wasn't about you," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "It wasn't even about Stephen. It was me. I think I was lost, searching for something I thought I needed, something to make me feel alive again. But it was never real. It was a fantasy, a lie, and I lost sight of everything that truly mattered. He looked away, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the desk as he struggled to compose himself. "You could have talked to me," he said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet anger, a disappointment that cut through me. "You could have told me how you felt. We could have worked through it together, instead of this." "I know," I whispered, my voice choked with regret. "I should have come to you. I should have been honest, but I was afraid of what you might think, of what it might mean. I didn't want to admit that I was unhappy, that I was struggling." He nodded, though his expression remained hard, filled with a quiet pain that made my heart ache. "So instead, you turned to him. You let him become a part of your life, a part of us." I felt the weight of his words settle over me, a painful reminder of the boundary I had crossed, the trust I had betrayed. "I know I can't take back what I've done," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to try to make things right. I want to be better, to be someone you can trust again, if you're willing to give me the chance." He looked at me, his gaze filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "I don't know if I can do that, Laura," he replied quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can look at you and not see everything that's happened." I felt a fresh wave of tears welling up in my eyes, the weight of his words pressing down on me, filling me with a sorrow that I couldn't escape. But I knew I had to accept his pain, his anger, to give him the space he needed to heal, even if it meant that I would never be a part of his life again. "If you need time, I understand," I whispered, my voice trembling. "And if you can't forgive me, if this is something we can't come back from, I understand that too. I want you to know that I'm sorry, truly, deeply sorry." He didn't respond, his silence a painful confirmation of the damage I had done, the chasm I had created between us. After a moment, I stood up, the weight of our conversation pressing down on me as I turned to leave, the finality of the moment settling over me like a shroud. Days turned into weeks, each one a quiet struggle as I tried to piece together the fragments of my life, to find a way to move forward from the wreckage I had created. My husband and I kept our distance, his presence a painful reminder of the love I had lost, the trust I had shattered. I spent my days in a haze of guilt and regret, the memories of my choices a constant reminder of the consequences I could never escape. Stephen reached out to me once, a brief message that lingered on my screen, a reminder of the connection we had shared, the choices we had made. But I didn't respond. I knew that whatever we'd had was over, a chapter of my life that I couldn't return to, a reminder of the person I had become in my search for something that had never truly existed. One night, as I sat alone in the quiet of my empty house, I realized that the only way forward was to let go of the guilt, the shame, the regret that had become my constant companions. I couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the damage I'd done, but I could choose to move forward, to rebuild my life from the ground up, to find a way to be the person I had lost somewhere along the way. I took a deep breath, the weight of my decisions settling over me, filling me with a quiet resolve that I hadn't felt in months. I knew that the road ahead would be long, filled with moments of doubt, of regret, of sorrow. But I also knew that I had to face it alone, to find a way to heal, to become someone worthy of the love, the trust, the life I had once taken for granted. As I turned out the lights and climbed into bed, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet acceptance of the life I had chosen, the path I had to walk. And as I closed my eyes, letting the memories of the past slip away, I knew that this was only the beginning, that the journey to redemption, to forgiveness, would be a long one. But I was ready to take the first step, to face the future with an open heart, a heart that, for the first time in a long time, was ready to heal.